There are people for whom emotional intelligence simply doesn't work. They understand what they feel, recognize patterns, know where their reactions come from, and can explain everything clearly. And yet, nothing settles, the tension remains, the body stays on alert. And over time, a quiet and uncomfortable question emerges: if I know all of this, why do I still feel this way? Why does something that is supposed to help seem to fail precisely with me? Indeed, controlling these mind-body processes is far from simple. When this happens, the conclusion is usually the same, and almost always unfair. I'm not trying hard enough. I'm not emotionally mature yet. If I were truly emotionally intelligent, this would already be resolved. Emotional intelligence, which was meant to bring relief, starts to act like a harsh judge, an uneven standard used to measure who is succeeding and who is failing. The implicit promise of emotional intelligence is simple. If you understand what you feel, you can regulate it. If you recognize the emotion, you can choose your response. If you observe carefully enough, you stop reacting automatically. But what is written in the fine print is that this promise assumes a prior condition, that the person's internal system already feels relatively safe. And that is precisely where the model begins to fail for some people. Because for them, the difficulty is not understanding the emotion. It is moving through it without the body going into alert. It is feeling without something inside interpreting that feeling as danger. For these people, emotion does not show up merely as information. It shows up as threat. And no amount of insight, by itself, convinces a nervous system that it is safe to lower its guard. This is where a central confusion emerges. Emotional intelligence is usually presented as a skill, something that can be trained, developed, refined. But in practice, it is often used as an expectation. In other words, it becomes an implicit demand for constant self-control. People say, take a deep breath. Think before you react. Don't take it personally. Be more rational. In this context, a skill turns into an obligation, and obligation turns into pressure. Gradually, the person begins to monitor themselves constantly. They observe every internal reaction, analyze every emotion that arises, monitor tone of voice, facial expression, response time. And they do this not to understand themselves, but to avoid getting it wrong, to avoid reacting badly, to avoid being seen as too much, too sensitive, too intense. Emotional intelligence turns into a sophisticated form of containment. But here is the point that is almost never said. Externally, this may look like maturity, calm, control. But behind this appearance are people who speak well about emotions, yet rarely seem relaxed. Internally, what exists is continuous effort, a constant sense of holding oneself together, as if there was something dangerous about letting emotion fully move through the body. At this point, regulation is not regulation. It is suppression disguised as control, an attempt to manage what cannot be managed. And there is an important detail here. Many of these people are not impulsive. They are not emotionally disorganized. Quite the opposite. They are highly aware, reflective, responsible. Precisely for that reason, the frustration is greater, because they are doing everything right. They are applying what they learned. They are following the guidelines. And still, relief does not come. Something inside remains on alert, as if it never received the message that everything is under control. Emotional intelligence often assumes that understanding comes before regulation. First, you understand what you're feeling, then you calm down. But for many people, this sequence simply does not happen. For them, the order is reversed. Without a minimal sense of safety, regulation is not possible. The body does not calm down just because the mind understood the explanation. While the nervous system remains in defense, every insight becomes something you understand better, but do not feel. Understanding only turns into change when the body stops protecting itself, and that does not happen through decision or willpower. This is why, in many cases, the more a person tries to regulate themselves, the more tense they become. The more they observe, the more rigid they feel. The more they try to respond better, the more distant they feel from themselves. The effort to be emotionally correct begins to replace the emotional experience itself. Instead of simply feeling, the person starts managing their emotions. Instead of moving through them, they control them. At this point, something almost imperceptible happens. The person begins to distrust their own emotions, not because they are chaotic, but because they feel inconvenient. They appear at the wrong time, with the wrong intensity, for the wrong duration. And emotional intelligence, which promised freedom, starts functioning as a filter. Only what is socially acceptable, understandable, and manageable is allowed to be felt. Without realizing it, you become surrounded by rules about what is appropriate to feel and how it is permitted to respond. But emotions do not work like that. Emotions do not follow schedules. They do not arise in the right proportion. They do not ask for permission. And when the internal system is safe, this is not a problem. In that context, emotion comes, passes, and reorganizes itself. But when the internal system is not safe, every emotion becomes an event to be managed. And living this way is exhausting. Much of the discourse around emotional intelligence emerged in very specific contexts: corporate environments, educational settings, leadership training. Places where emotion is seen as something to be managed so it does not interfere with performance. In these environments, emotion is not dangerous. It is inconvenient, something that needs to be calibrated, adjusted, channeled. This perspective makes sense when the bond between people is not at stake. But there are people for whom emotion was never merely inconvenient. It was risky. Expressing too much had consequences. Reacting led to loss. Feeling resulted in rejection, intrusion, or abandonment. For these systems, emotion is not neutral. It carries memory. These people learned early that feeling could be costly, and that learning does not dissolve simply because someone explained the concept of self-regulation. When emotion arises, the body does not ask whether it is appropriate, it asks whether it is safe. And if, at some point in one's history, the answer was no, the system reacts before the mind can intervene. This is not a lack of emotional intelligence. It is an organism doing exactly what it learned to do: protect itself. In this context, asking for more emotional control can have the opposite effect. It can reinforce vigilance, increase self-criticism, intensify the sense of inadequacy. The person not only feels the emotion, they also blame themselves for feeling it. They not only react, they judge themselves for having reacted. Used this way, emotional intelligence deepens internal division. This helps explain why so many emotionally aware people live exhausted. They are not disconnected from their emotions. They are trapped with them, not because they feel too much, but because they never allow themselves to move through the experience fully. Everything is observed, named, analyzed, but little is metabolized. The body remains on standby, as if something still needs to be avoided. What is not made explicit in the belief that control comes through emotional intelligence is this: the foundation of regulation is safety, not emotional awareness. Without safety, the internal system experiences the world as unpredictable. And in an unpredictable world, control is not a luxury, it is a necessity. Emotional intelligence then stops being a resource and becomes an exhausting duty. Seen from this angle, something reorganizes. The problem is not that emotional intelligence does not work, it is that it is being asked to replace something it cannot replace. It is trying to occupy the place of safety experiences that were never sufficiently lived. No cognitive skill compensates for a body that still lives as if the past were active. This also changes how we understand failure. It is not a lack of effort, not unconscious resistance, not immaturity. It is coherence. The system is doing exactly what it learned to do: protect, anticipate, control. And while that logic remains active, asking for relaxation is asking for the impossible. Perhaps that is why so many people feel deep relief when they realize that this is not about trying harder, that it is not about becoming even more aware, that it is not about mastering emotions like a technique. For some people, the path does not begin with emotional intelligence. It begins with the possibility of existing without constant vigilance. This does not invalidate emotional intelligence. It simply puts it in its proper place, not as a starting point, but as a consequence. Not as a requirement, but as something that emerges when the system no longer needs to defend itself from itself. When feeling stops being interpreted as threat, understanding becomes possible. and regulating emotions stops being an artificial, continuous effort. So perhaps the final question is not, why doesn't emotional intelligence work for me? But another, more honest and more compassionate one. What did my system need to learn in order to survive before any skill could develop? When this question is asked with care, something important happens. Guilt gives way to understanding. Self-demand softens. Failure stops being personal, because in the end, emotional intelligence does not fail for everyone. It fails when it is used to demand emotional control where safety is still missing. And no emotional theory can replace what the body has not yet lived, the experience that feeling does not have to be dangerous. Perhaps the problem was never a lack of emotional intelligence. Perhaps the problem was asking for control from a system that still needed protection. And as long as feeling continues to be interpreted as risk, no skill will bring rest. Because regulation does not begin when you understand more. It begins when the body discovers, for the first time, that it no longer needs to defend itself.